which is going on right now in Atlanta. So perhaps you're at the wrong self. All right. So with that out of the way, yeah, if you're watching the self hashtag, you find interesting things. All right, with that out of the way, real quickly. So I'm a recovering sysadmin. I worked in operations for about a decade, and I still have the scars and all the emotional baggage that comes with carrying a pager for 10 years. I'm now a director at the Apache Software Foundation, and I also run the infrastructure group there. Separately from that, because the foundation as a corporate entity keeps a pretty bright line separation, I'm on the project management committee for a number of projects at the ASF, notably JClouds, which is a cloud abstraction library, CloudStack, which is an infrastructure as a service platform, and the Apache Incubator, which is how projects come into the ASF. And Citrix employs me, and I work in the open source business office at Citrix. And so I've been around for a little while doing cloud stuff, and before that I was involved in things like Fedora, where I worked for a number of years, and got involved in a number of things there. But I want to ask some questions of you, because now you know everything about me, and I only know a few things about you. One of them is that you're here very early. So let me ask you some questions. How many people are using open source software here? Anybody not? Maybe that's the better question. Okay, one outlier, our contrarian. How many people are using it in their work environment? Okay, almost everyone. How many of this group are contributing to an open source project? Okay. So if you've seen how many people in the room are raising their hands, it's an order of magnitude less for people who are contributing compared to people who are using open source in a commercial environment. I do know that I am asking these questions at an open source conference, so I'm probably actually getting a higher return than I would expect otherwise. But let's talk about. I want to talk about some history when we're talking about tragedy. So let's talk about. Anyone recognize this logo? This is Heartbleed. Anyone have pain caused by Heartbleed? I did. So if you're not familiar, Heartbleed was a security bug found with the OpenSSL encryption library. And it was found in April of 2014, and it was horrendous. If you believe Forbes, they said that it is the worst vulnerability found in software since traffic began progressing over the internet. And there were a number of things that we learned out of that. You raising your hand for something? Yes. Well, so maybe by impact, in terms of impact. It may not be the worst in terms of true exploitability, but I think in terms of impact that it had, that's true. One of the things we did learn, though, is exactly how OpenSSL was being cared for. Anyone know how many people were working on OpenSSL full-time at the time the bug was discovered? One person was being paid full-time. Anyone want to know how much he was paid for that work? 20 grand a year. Exciting opportunities for your career in open source. Go make 20 grand a year maintaining something core to the security of the internet. Yeah, so one guy. There's since been more people, and actually for the year leading up to Heartbleed, the total income brought in, or total donations brought into the OpenSSL Foundation, $2,000. Think about that for a second. So when you look at when you look at a lot of the analysis that was done after, a lot of people said, oh, OpenSSL is too complex. OpenSSL is, they didn't have enough people reviewing, and all of these problems that people cited, many of them technical, and they're valid points. But someone said, what we have is an economic problem. Our software is not sustaining itself from an economic perspective. Anyone recognize that logo? This is Shell Shock. Anybody want to guess how many maintainers there were for Bash when Shell Shock came out? One. This is a common theme, right? One person, and Shell Shock is Chet Ramey was the maintainer. Again, one person who was focused on this full time, and everyone else is doing it, as they saw fit, which is fine. That's how open source grew up, right? Is people would work on it to scratch an itch, and that's still perfectly valid. But when you consider how crucial this is, how many systems it affected, because it wasn't just desktop machines, it wasn't just servers running somewhere. A lot of appliances had Bash as the default shell. So Shell Shock is yet another example. Anyone read this article in ProPublica? All right, so it's too early for that loud. Thank you, sir. So this article in ProPublica broke. If you use encryption from GPG or PGP, you're probably using this guy's GnuPG tools. One guy, at one point, again, another pattern here, one guy, he was averaging, actually, he was doing a little better than the SSL guys. He was averaging about 26,000 a year. And he had gotten some grants from the federal government in Germany, and they had allowed him to hire an intern at one point, but then that funding ran out. So again, another core library that a lot of people depend on, maybe not to the same degree as SSL, but it's a big deal nonetheless. And we discover, hey, there's only one guy paying attention. But this isn't even limited to that. Anyone here familiar with Codehouse? No? Okay, Codehouse is based in Australia, was based in Australia, and they provided project hosting and support. So they would do mailing lists and bug trackers. They provided a Jira instance and a Confluence instance, and places like Maven and Groovy and Grails ran there, along with scores of others. I mean, literally hundreds of projects. And this year, early this year, in March, they said, we can't sustain this. And what they had determined was they had become so popular that their bandwidth and server costs were so great that it was outstripping their donations. And people were having to pay $1,000 out of their own pocket just to keep servers online. And it's not like they didn't have free resources donated. So Contigix, for instance, donated most of the infrastructure for Codehouse, but it still wasn't enough. And at the end of the day, Codehouse and all of the projects there had to find a new home, and it shut down. And here's the obligatory Star Wars reference. We essentially lost this resource that people had grown accustomed to for over a decade. And Codehouse was probably the European and Australian equivalent of SourceForge at the time. And instead of people slowly migrating away as they did with SourceForge, a lot of people were still very active at Codehouse. And despite all of the good work they did, that disappeared. So with that as a framework, just kind of some of the recent history in the past year or so. I want to talk about some other things, ways of evaluating some of this. So at the ASF, for whatever reason, there are some people who are fascinated with ponies. And so some of the math has taken on pony references, and one of them is pony factor. It's a way that we evaluate projects. It's one factor. It's not the only one. So as a director at the ASF, I have about 70 projects a month that submit a report to the board, and the 9 directors go through each of those reports. And we also look at statistics around the project. We look at how many emails are traversing the list, how many commits are happening, how many releases of software have occurred. And projects report to us generally on a quarterly basis. So we've got a little over 200, and so about 70 a month submit a report. So one of the things that I care about is sustainability, and it's one of the things that I'm looking for in a project. And so we have a number of measures. Pony factor is one of them that I look at closely, because there's something that, if a project is active and it's vibrant and it's making releases and there are plenty of people who care about it, that's great. That's what you want in a project. But if we let a project appear to be active, they have an active website, they still have software for download, then people assume that it's going to be active, and that's at worst, or at best, it's false advertising. At worst, it's irresponsible behavior. And so the ASF has a process called putting a project in the attic that essentially deprecates that and kind of says, there's nothing inherently wrong with the software. There's just nobody paying attention anymore. So, take that, make that part of your judgment as to whether you use it or not. So pony factor, I haven't told you really what it is. So we look at source code, and a lot of projects, if you look at the Apache web server source code tree, it goes back about 20 years at this point. Actually a little further, 20 years since the Apache group began working on it. A lot of that history is well and good, but we want to look and see if it's being actively maintained. So we're taking a 2-year chunk of time, and we're saying, first of all, how much is happening in that 2-year chunk of time, and who's actually working on it. And when we start looking at the list of authors, we try and figure out what is the smallest number of people that have written more than 50% of the code base. And so that's pony factor. So we did this with Apache projects, right? And I'm thrilled to death that a project that I work heavily on, CloudStack, has 17 people who've written 50% of the code base. That's the smallest number you can get to hit 50%. Hadoop has 13, the Apache web server 9, Subversion, which I find interesting, had 7 people in the past couple of years who've written more than 50% of the code base. So this is interesting, and obviously this isn't all of the Apache projects, and we have a number of projects that are getting down below that 4.3.2 type of number and are cause for concern. But then we said, how do we compare with the rest of the world? Maybe Apache is doing better or doing worse, but how do we know? So we went and looked at a number of other projects. So Linux is, and that's completely off the, Linux is at 11, which you can't see. I don't know why the numbers are cut off there. Anyway, Linux is at 11. You have Ruby on Rails at 7, but you also have a lot of projects on the opposite end of the scale. So Git, arguably the most popular version control system today, one person has written 50% or more of the code in the past 2 years. Compare that just for a second with Subversion, 7 people. Something feels amiss there. But Nginx, also 1 person. Node has 2. A lot of interesting things. VLC has 3 people that are writing 50% of the code or more. So, there are problems everywhere, and it's in places you wouldn't expect. Git, right? Who would expect that one person would be writing more than 50% of Git? Yes. Commit logs, because you can specify how far to go back. So we're looking at line count with a commit range of 2 years back. I actually have detailed math on that if you're really interested in it. There's actually a great graphical representation of that, which is so the person who actually came up with Pony Factor, his name is Daniel Gruno, and you can follow him on Twitter at Humbedo, which is HUMBEDOOH. And his Twitter avatar is a stuffed pony, so you can kind of see where this came from. Couple of other interesting things. OpenSSL was listed at 2 people having written 50% of the code, and we ran this in spring of 2015. The other interesting to me is Perl. Perl currently has 3 people who've written 50% of the code. There's a lot of Perl code still running, and 3 people maintaining the language is at least concerning, right? So this is brief overview of how we were evaluating Pony Factor. So we continue our farmyard animal series. Commons, tragedy of the commons is an economic principle that really came about in 1968. But originally, an English economist, William Lloyd, wrote about the tragedy of the commons in 1833. And the commons were a common grazing area available to everyone. So it wasn't anyone's property. You could bring your animals there and graze in England, and people did so. And he saw a problem. Specifically, the problem that he was seeing were that people were essentially grazing it bare, and they would bring their sheep and their goats and cows, and they would graze the entire place bare and leave nothing for anyone else, which is part of a problem. But also, it would destroy the environment for them for the future instead of using it responsibly. In 1968, Garrett Hardin, an ecologist, wow, I can talk, an ecologist wrote about the tragedy of the commons, building on that. And essentially, it's a situation where individuals acting independently and rationally for their own self-interest behave contrary to the best interest of a group by depleting a common resource and ultimately acting in contrary to their own best interest. This kind of struck home with me, but it's not a perfect analogy, right? So the commons, there's only a limited amount of land and a limited amount of grass, whereas we can duplicate software really easily. Copying bits is essentially a zero-cost function, but developing and maintaining is not. And so there's a lot of this, there are a lot of similarities, but there's also some places where it breaks down. And at the same time, I think, wow, open source has come a long way. When I started in open source, there was a lot of resistance, especially from businesses. No one wanted that free software, hippie software in their data center. And we've come really a long way. Just to, Mark Andreessen is a venture capitalist. He runs a VC firm in the Bay Area. And in the Wall Street Journal, he wrote an article there, and one of the quotes out of that was, "Software is eating the world." And we have places where we're replacing hardware with software. We're replacing what used to be a human-only function with software. And really, software is not just changing, but consuming the world. Open source has become the de facto. You are not going to deploy a new technology that is not going to be open source. You want to do containers? Every container technology of note is open source. You want to do cluster management? that's started out as open source. You want to do big data. All the de facto software packages you would use are open source. Basically, any new technology that's coming out there is assumed to be open source. I was in Tokyo last week and had dinner with Jim Zemlin, who's the executive director of the Linux Foundation. And he told me about his experience with the Node folks. And he said, they don't remember all of the open source struggles. They don't remember the reasons for RMS being so insistent on copyleft. They don't remember all of the pushback we had from businesses who were so scared about liability. They assume that sharing is by default, and they assume that people will just share back with them. And that has become, for better or worse, what we assume. Open source has really changed the tech industry and certainly the software world. One of my favorite quotes that builds on the earlier one is from Ibrahim Haddad. And he said, it's not just software that's eating the world, it's open source software that's eating the world. Ibrahim works at Samsung now, and he went on to say, you can't build a product today without open source. If you go buy a TV or a camera or a cellular phone or even a refrigerator, there's open source in it. And it is the foundational level of so much that we buy now, even when we're not buying software. And it makes sense, right? Why would you go and invest the time to build all of that foundational infrastructure? Turning a TV on, essentially booting a TV. Why would you go do that with a proprietary operating system you're going to have to build and maintain? Why not build atop what other people are doing? So it makes perfect sense that you would build that on open source. But so much of the time, we're focusing on building new functionality, and we're focusing on building new features into software. We're not focusing on maintenance. So I'd like to offer some contrast. Let's take Google Web Fonts. Anyone using Google Web Fonts for stuff? Okay. If you're doing anything on the web, you're using Google Web Fonts and don't know it. They are pervasive at this point and widely used, and it's a great resource, right? Google's providing freely licensed fonts. But in the past year, Google has dedicated more developer time to optimizing font sizes, font colors, icon shapes, and other trivial visual details, especially for their ads and applications, that OpenSSL developers have spent over the lifetime of their project. It's not, right? We focus on the things that we think are important, and apparently fonts and colors are more important. So Arby's, right? Arby's has a dedicated website team, right? And they sell basically one type of sandwich. You can get different toppings and stuff like that. But they sell one type of sandwich, and they need a website to advertise that, apparently. So that website is staffed by a team of well-paid professionals who do that, only the website as their day job. In a week, the Arby's website team has more developer resources than OpenSSL does in a year. Because obviously we care about selling sandwiches more than we care about securing traffic on the internet. Joe has pointed out that I do not want the Arby's website team responsible for the security of all the internet. And that is probably a fair statement. However, I would happily take the dollars allocated to the website team and allocate that to OpenSSL or Bash or GnuPG for that matter. And that's really what it is. It's not, I'm not saying, hey, those website developers are doing terrible things, because why aren't they doing open source instead? We all have jobs to do, and have to make money to live. So I'm not vilifying them in any way. But when I think about Arby's as a company, or Google as a company, that depends upon this core infrastructure, it's hard to rationalize a choice like the resources tossed behind Google Web Fonts compared to what's tossed behind OpenSSL. So I want to toss out a couple of ideas. The first is that it is radically easy to become part of a critical software project. For a lot of them, there just aren't many people even paying attention. So another person showing up, that's a big deal. Yes, there are projects like Linux that have thousands of contributors. There are projects like OpenStack that have hundreds or bordering on thousands of contributors. Yes, you can get involved there, and it's probably even easier for you to get involved there because lots of hype around both of them. But you could also go and get involved with Bash, or you could go and get involved with OpenSSL or help out GnuPG, and even as a volunteer, have a huge impact on that project. And also a huge impact because those are critical software projects. And there are scores of them. I called out 3 examples. One of the researchers, I think this was David Wheeler, Dr. David Wheeler, who does a lot of military research around open source. And I think he said that it's not a question of, how did this happen? But with the number of people paying attention, it's a question of why is this not happening more frequently? So I think the first thing I would say is find an open source project that you can help. If we took more responsibility for the awesome ecosystem of software that open source has made available to us, maybe we wouldn't be having these kind of problems. I'll bring up the Common Infrastructure Initiative. This is something that the Linux Foundation started after Heartbleed. And essentially, it's a pool of money that companies contribute to. And then they go and look for things like OpenSSL, GnuPG, and they say, hey, let's fund some people to work on this full time, or let's audit all of this software and pay a professional auditing company to go through and do a security audit. I think that's interesting. If you work for a company that's large enough to participate in that, your company should. I think there are currently 24 members who are part of Common Infrastructure Initiative, but there should be more. Really, any company of any size should be ponying up for that. But here's something I think: if you can't get your company to toss money into Common Infrastructure Initiative, and you're not going to go do it yourself, you're not going to go get involved in a project, make the case that your company should invest. And I think there's 2 ways you can invest. I think the first is that you could pay a vendor, and you could pay a vendor that does a good job of upstreaming. Yes, vendors are there to make money, and open source, we have this expectation that the software itself will be free. But a number of vendors do a good job of upstreaming work. Red Hat's probably the poster boy for... if anyone hasn't noticed, Joe works for Red Hat. But Red Hat does a good job of not just investing in the technologies they sell, but investing in the ecosystem around it. There are plenty of vendors like that. Pick one that's actively contributing. There is a large company in the Northwest who sells cloud services. And for the longest time, my complaint with them was you're building on open source, and you're virtually invisible in the open source ecosystem. You're not contributing back and helping ensure that that thing that makes your service possible continues to function. That started to improve, and that's why I'm not calling out a name, but they're starting to cycle back. But if you're using a vendor and that vendor is building all of their stuff on open source and they're not contributing code back in the process, that should be a huge warning flag. That's an active threat to your business. Quite honestly, all of this is an active threat to your business, right? You wouldn't go buy a building or take a building for free and then never maintain it for 20 or 30 years, would you? Have your employer allow you to contribute upstream. And this is a big hurdle for folks, but most people are, I find, even the stock sysadmins are patching stuff locally to scratch their own itch, and they could be contributing that upstream, much less if they're actually having to do any real development. Get some of that, get 20% time, talk them into that, make them understand the value proposition that really what you're doing is you're doing that maintenance, the ongoing maintenance. One of the interesting things that I found was when looking at OpenSSL is that lots of people were funding developers to work on new functionality in OpenSSL. They were adding new features, they were adding new content and new encryption types to OpenSSL, but they weren't actually keeping up with the ongoing maintenance. No one was going cleaning up code or anything of that nature, and certainly no one was paying for it. So I think it's important that we look at this from a maintenance perspective, not, hey, I've got to go fix a bug that's really annoying me, and I'm going to fix that one bug and stop. There needs to be some long-term dedication to things that matter to us as individuals and to businesses. And I think businesses make the most sense because they have the most to lose out of it. And so I want to have your questions, your comments, and your flames right now. Tell me where I'm wrong, and I'm not going to pick you. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. So I'll tell you about a couple. Google Summer of Code does a good job with individual students. There are a couple of other interesting programs out there. One of them is Outreachy. They're targeting largely females, and they're going to start targeting other underrepresented classes. Those two are the immediate ones that jump to mind. There's Posse, P-O-S-S-E, which is, what's Posse stand for? Anyway, it's essentially educating comp sci professors in open source practices so that they can then go bring their students doing like a capstone project in open source. But that's focused on the instructors themselves. If there's a guy out here, I think he's wearing a blue shirt. He's sitting in front of the 3D printer. His name's Spot Calloway. You should talk to him because he's focusing on trying to get open source into universities. And he's doing that with a number of other folks, but he's the only person I know that's here that's focused on it. So there are some of those initiatives, but the cost is very high for that. So about 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, I worked with a group at RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, and we brought one of their classes on board to work in the Fedora project. And we essentially had them for a semester, and we spent a lot of that semester ramping them up because comp sci generally doesn't teach you how to use version control. The concept of mailing lists, especially on 19, 20, 21, 22-year-olds, is a foreign thing. So is IRC. So acclimating them, the cost is very high, and then typically they're gone in a semester. Ideally, you'll get a few people who will stick around and will continue contributing. But the cost to do that is pretty high. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. Just understand the cost involved, and really, without a really engaged professor who understands it, has been through the process, um, I'm almost pessimistic enough to say that the cost is too high without that heavily involved prof. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. So this gentleman was talking about university system in South Carolina, and specifically Clemson, being tasked to provide support for all of the Medicaid servers in the state, and how that as a part of that, they were contributing back to open source and specifically to SALT, both paying a vendor and getting code back upstream as well. Yes, sir, in the back of the room. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and I'll repeat real quickly. If you want to hand the mic to the next person, he was saying that really the only contribution back is when universities are having side projects. So he specifically cited Indiana University and their cybersecurity research group, and they're getting in grant money from NHS and NSF to do various types of work, and are able to do some of that, right? But it's directly funded. Yeah. Yes, sir.
With the small size of the number of contributors to these large projects, these very important projects, I've worked with development teams. I'm not a developer, but I've worked with them and for companies, and usually there's a QA department. I don't see how with one developer you can have a separate person doing QA, and so that means that this stuff isn't really being tested. And I've heard that that we rely on millions of eyes looking at the source code, but it doesn't really look like anyone's looking at it, or at least not very many people are looking at it. So how do you address that? Because when you make changes to stuff that people are depending on all over the world, and it really hasn't had anyone banging on it to see, well, what could.
Yeah. So specifically, that problem is so. First of all, Linus's law, right? With enough eyes, any problem is shallow, right? Any bug is shallow, and that's true. But as you pointed out, a lot of these projects with one or two developers, they don't have enough eyes to even do basic code review, much less doing any kind of QA or serious testing. Um, out of Heartbleed, a lot of the commentary that was done, a lot of the research that was done. There's a paper actually entitled "How Do We Prevent the Next Heartbleed?" And it says, if we had had a basic test suite that did, just stupid things that, push invalid feeds to these libraries and see what happens, we would have found this problem. And why did we not have a test suite that a developer could run against it, as opposed to committing code, compiling, shipping, and done with it? It's a very real problem. It's we depend upon a lot of these very esoteric sometimes, but very common libraries and software packages, and there aren't enough people with eyes on it, not enough people paying attention. I think it's the biggest threat to open source is that we're going to develop a reputation for having things like Heartbleed and Shell Shock, and that because no one is quote unquote paying attention, we suddenly go from this reputation for having very robust peer-reviewed software to that's not really different than paying paying a developer in-house to write something and never letting anybody look at it before we press it into production, which no business would do, right? No sane business would take something and inject it into something that's important to the business. Yes, ma'am.
Check. Okay. I'm wondering if a little bit of it is also sort of cultural. So when you shared the statistics on how many developers had pushed up patches, I don't know if there was a way to look at who did review of patches alongside that. And so many of the tools that we choose to use and be like, oh, here's our star contributor, Dave Nalley, who's put in like 10,000 lines of code this year. He's awesome. And then it's like, who reviewed all that code? And it's like, oh, I don't know. We don't have a way to check that. Someone must have, I'm sure. And so we don't also put like, and thank God Joe Brockmeyer looked at all that code, because like otherwise it would have been an unholy nightmare. So we culturally sort of reward just lines of code, and we never do the thing where we're like, hey, code review, that was also awesome. Or we rarely do it. I've seen it maybe once out in the wild. The Twisted project was having that problem where they were getting lots of patches submitted and new contributors that were really excited, and then no one would review it because they weren't getting any gold stars for doing it. And so they gamified it. Like you got, like 10,000 points for 3 code reviews, and then like your lines of code you got less gold stars for. And then all of a sudden everyone was like, as soon as something came up for review, people were fighting over it.
Yeah. So I think that's a good point. Because we have version control systems, that's an easy way to look at who's committing code. We have GitHub pull requests. We have review board, Garrett. We have people who don't do code review through any of those tools. So getting metrics on that's a little more, I don't want to say difficult. It's no more difficult than anything else, but it's more fractured. And because it's more fractured, we don't have a common interface for it. We also don't have a good common interface for rating the quality either of lines of code submitted or of rating the quality of reviews. And that's also a problem. And Pony Factor is a great back of the napkin health check. It shouldn't be the only one. There are projects in there that look like they have a great health statistic that I wouldn't necessarily trust. Joe, do you want to say something now? I assume so. Yeah, I'll go back and I'll say something else. I don't think that it's just developers. I do not think developers should be our mantra. Someone's already taken it anyway, right? But I think open source projects deeply need someone who cares. And it may not be writing code, it may not be triaging bugs, it may not be doing code review, but a lot of these projects desperately need someone who cares. And you would be surprised at the difference that that can make. You know, even if it's, I'm going to write a blog post about how to use whatever package, that's probably more public exposure than a lot of these projects that aren't in the hype cycle have gotten in years, and is well worth the investment. Mm-hmm. So I'm down to 5 minutes. I'm going to take this gentleman's question real quickly, and hang on 1 second. Hang on 1 second. So a lot of the previous question and comments were around school systems are not open source friendly, and so we end up with an education system that tends to not be open source friendly, which inhibits a lot of what we want to try and achieve in open source. And there was some discussion back and forth in the room about taking matching donations from employers and funneling that into open source, getting involved in the local school system to start some of those changes. And yes, sir. And the final comment there was that the school system has a limited budget, and they get contract deals with companies like Dell or Microsoft, wherein they can buy 20 computers at a discount, but they have to run Windows. They're limited in the application suites that they can install thereafter by the terms of that contract. Anyway, folks, I will be here the rest of the weekend. Feel free to come talk to me or harass me via email or Twitter. Thanks very much for coming and staying.
Your customers rely on your website or application. If it's slow or non-responsive, it infuriates your users and costs you money. Keeping your business-critical systems humming along requires insight into what they're doing. Your system metrics tell stories that can reveal performance bottlenecks, resource limitations, and other problems. But how do you keep an eye on all of your system's performance metrics in real time and record this data for later analysis? Enter Longview, the new way to see what's really going on under the hood. The Longview dashboard lets you visualize the status of all your systems, providing you with a bird's-eye view of your entire fleet. You can sort by CPU, memory, swap, processes load, and network usage. Click a specific system to access its individual dashboard, then click and drag to zoom in on choke points and get more detail. Comprehensive network data, including inbound and outbound traffic, is available on the Network tab, and disk writes and free space on the Disks tab, while the Process Explorer displays usage statistics for individual processes. The System Info tab shows listening services, active connections, and available updates. Adding Longview to a system is easy. Just click the button, copy the one-line installation command, then run the command on your Linux system to complete the process. The agent will begin collecting data and sending it to Longview. Then the graphs start rolling. Use Longview to gain visibility into your servers, so when your website or app heats up, it stays up.
Citrix Zen Server gives you everything you need to integrate, manage, and automate a virtual data center, all on an enterprise-class, cloud-proven virtual platform, and at a third of the cost of other solutions. But why even bother with virtualizing your server infrastructure in the first place? Well, let's say you have a traditional one server to one application architecture, but you're running out of resources and performance is suffering. Once you order new server hardware, you'll wait for delivery, configure it, install your business application, stage and test the server, and finally, add it to your production farm. If you've been through this process before, you know it can take weeks or even months. You also know it's a manually intensive process that will burden your team every time you outgrow your current setup. With a virtual server solution, you could accomplish all of that in less than half a day. Server virtualization software separates the OS and application from the underlying server hardware. And with multiple virtual machines on a single server, you can use each of them to run different OSs and applications. This makes it possible to move your virtual machines from one piece of hardware to another whenever you want, to maximize utilization, simplify maintenance, or recover from a hardware failure, and without slowing down your applications or users. Clearly, server virtualization provides big benefits, and Citrix Zen Server provides even more. Since it's built on an open platform, Zen Server plays well with your existing hardware, storage systems, and IT management software, as well as with the industry's leading cloud service providers. Best of all, you can get started by downloading a fully functional, production-ready version of Zen Server for free. After a 10-minute installation process, you'll see how easy it is to start virtualizing your workloads and automating your IT management processes. And when you're ready for a richer set of management tools, just upgrade to one of the premium editions of Zen Server. So whether you're interested in virtualizing servers for the first time, expanding your server virtualization footprint, or moving server workloads to the cloud, download and install Zen Server today and see how it can help you simplify your IT environment. Citrix Zen Server. Do more. Don't spend more.